The recent military clampdown on Daily Trust offices in Abuja and Maiduguri, Borno State, which led to the arrest of two of the newspaper's journalists, is raising concerns about the safety of media practitioners, especially as the elections draw closer. In this exclusive, Amnesty International's Country Director Osai Ojigbo spoke to Roots TV on this, as well as how journalists can better protect themselves during attack by security operatives.
Amnesty International recently got an order from the military to shut down following a report that you released about the way they handled insurgency and all of that. And quite recently, in fact, just a few days ago, Daily Trust newspapers' offices in Lagos, Abuja, Borno got shut down by the military. Well, practically the same thing, releasing a report the military found, unflattering, unsavory. According to them, it leaked secret on what they were planning to do in terms of fighting terrorism. Do you see this as a pattern of, stifling free speech and maybe high-handedness from the military?
Thank you for your observation. We've actually been monitoring this issue of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press over a long period of time. So it's not just today that we've been noticing that anytime there's a statement or a release or a report that is not favorable or seems to provide information which the authorities do not want out there, that there tends to be attempts to try and find out who the sources of this information are, and to try and also control what kind of information is made available out there. And if we look at the last 7-8 years in Nigeria, you would find that there's been this back and forth between the media and within the right to information. Even despite the fact that we have the Freedom of Information Act, it's still a struggle to get any sort of information, even information that should be available to the public, made to journalists and made to those who are requesting it. And in recent times, we've seen attacks against journalists. And if you go back as far back as 2013, 2014, anytime there seems to be some sort of event that is going on, whether it's elections upcoming or whether the government is launching a particular program, you find that when journalists produce alternative views or produce information that has not been produced by government sources, that there tends to be greater scrutiny of those reports, like as if they are not genuine or that there's something unscrupulous about it. And while it has always been a case of disclaimer and then people coming on to the press, whether it's on the news or on the radio or in the papers, to say, no, this is not the position, we're now seeing physical threats against journalists. We've had journalists who have been manhandled. We've had bloggers who have been called for questioning, some illegally detained and held even beyond the constitutional permissible time so that they can divulge their sources, or so that they can institute some sort of force to get them to retract the information that has been shared. If we look at 2017-2018, we can't forget the incidents that involved the Lombard brothers, who run their Lombard.com news service, whereby they were picked up by the security service in order to explain a news story which allegedly was published on their site, which they denied ever publishing. Then you have cases of Tony Ezimako, that was in 2018, who had released some information regarding the exchange of ransom for the kidnapped Chibok girls and how there could have been some sort of illicit transfers involving the military and the people who were actually designated to negotiate the release of these girls. And it was held in SSS detention for about 7 days, and if not for the outcry and the pushback by the community, probably would still have been there. And even then, he was cautioned to ensure that, look, the information that is already out there, we will be monitoring you to make sure you don't put anything that would, put the government at risk, attack our security. And security and terrorism has been used as an excuse now in order to intimidate and attack freedom of speech. If you look at the case of the journalist John Sabiri, that was in incommunicado detention by the Secret Service for over 2 years. At some point, people didn't even know whether he was alive or dead. And until CPJ and a few other organizations, including Amnesty International, went on a weekly pressure Twitter hunt to say, where is Abiri Jones? Where is he kept? What is happening? And how can we ensure that somebody like him gets to see the light of day again? Nobody would have even known that Jones Abiri was still in detention. And when he was eventually released, he successfully sued the State Security Agency for about 10 million naira. Whether they will pay that is another thing that that is another case for discussion. But you see that there is a pattern, and that it has moved beyond just disclaiming and then bringing contrary views on media platforms to now actually physically manhandling journalists when they cover events. We've had cases of people whose cameras have been smashed, people whose clothes have been torn, people who faced mob action as a result of trying to cover a story, to also cases of intimidation, people who have been charged and illegally detained, some on very flagrant and spurious allegations, all in a bid to justify why they are keeping them in detention, and also in an attempt to distinguish between the trade they are doing, which is journalism, as well as the incident that has happened. So, for example, you look at Premium Times, Samuel Ogundipe, the news story he released sometime in 2018, where they accused him of stealing sensitive information from the police. But actually what he was doing was presenting information which he had received based on a story he was running. But you see, the charge he was not charged for reporting a story, he was charged for stealing police information, because they are trying to also separate who the journalist is from the story that has been produced, thereby justifying the actions they have taken. And then using the Terrorism Act, because everybody now is, of course, very fearful for their lives, very concerned about what is going on with terrorism and going on with insurgency, particularly in the Northeast, that they are willing to exchange fear for protection. So when they say somebody is being charged under the Terrorism Act, automatically you feel perhaps there's some truth in it. But actually, it's also a ploy in order to ensure that people cannot freely share information they've received, and which actually limits our rights and access to information, which is a critical component of freedom of expression. Media houses have been raided, some have been demolished. We had the case of Breeze FM in Nasarawa State in 2017, the case of the Ayefele studio in Ibadan in 2018. Daily Trust, of course, was raided. It's the most recent, and it's almost like you make a story and then we use force. And this is something we need to address at a larger scale, because as long as we tolerate it, when I say we as a people, we tolerate these invasions, then it means that we tactfully also are contributing to this continued abuse of freedom of expression. We want information, so it means we need to speak up and speak out when people who provide this information are threatened, they are harassed, they are intimidated, because ultimately it means that we will never get the full picture of what is going on in our country.
Now, the military, some may say, is a separate arm, but we are still under a government. So I'm not trying to connect dots here, but can you, in the bigger picture, say that the government really is the one trying to stifle free speech? Elections are just, few days, few weeks away. And there is a sense of A, censorship, B, fear, 3, caution on what should be news and what shouldn't be news anymore, because they may be succeeding in putting fear in journalists, in the media, and conveyors of this information. So can you say, do you think it makes sense to say this could also be a government extension of stifling free speech and freedom of expression?
The government has the sole responsibility to ensure they protect human rights in Nigeria. And freedom of expression is one of those rights. So they have the first responsibility to protect. They also have the responsibility to promote and to ensure that wherever freedom of expression is, they actually promote and they actually ensure complete access to it. So when we see these sort of attacks, we ask ourselves, what is the government doing to ensure that they do better at protecting the human rights of journalists and of people when they speak truth and when they actually provide information and facts concerning issues of interest? And the government, of course, like in the case of Daily Trust, had come out to condemn the invasion of the Daily Trust premises. Well, we are asking, what do they need to do to go further? They need to reassure the press. They need to reassure the population that they stand for freedom of speech and that they will protect it without any fear or favor, regardless of which institution or arm of government is involved in either questioning or in determining what can be said and not said. And that is what we need to see a bit more strongly from the government. It's not enough to just give a statement, oh, we order them to move away, this is not acceptable. But what are you doing to ensure something like this does not happen? And when it happens, those responsible for violating this right are actually made to face the rule of law to actually ensure it doesn't happen again.
How can we as journalists protect ourselves, because the elections are coming and it's a very sensitive period, and we are hoping to the barest minimum that media is not clamped down, journalists are not hurt, but they could be. The possibility of those incidences happening are pretty high. So how can journalists protect themselves, and what should they do if situations of this nature come up?
Like you noted, this is something that is really grievous. If a journalist is locked up, it means he or she can't do her job, and it means that we have already closed one gap of information source. And so what needs to happen is that whenever these attacks come or threats, journalists need to raise the alarm as soon as possible. The good thing is that we now have online access, and of course Twitter is the platform of choice. So it would be good if we are able to get a situation where journalists can use Twitter accounts of credible organizations, their organizations or their own Twitter handles, in order to share information regarding a threat or an ongoing attack. That way they are able to mobilize as journalists themselves, but they're also to alert civil society organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, and other NGOs who are working very hard and monitoring the situation of human rights protection and of particular of journalists in the country. The second thing is that journalists also have to make sure that they are operating with the highest form of ethics and the highest form of professionalism. In the past, there have been allegations of journalists who have abused their positions in order for personal gain, or because they also have particular political or religious interests. When you do the work of journalism, you have to be someone that is impartial, someone that provides the facts as it is, and someone that maintains the highest form of ethics. The issue where we have situations where people question journalist integrity needs to be viewed very strongly by the industry. The other area is in the issue of preparing yourself. When you know that you are going to prepare or release a report that could potentially be controversial or raise issues that could put you at risk, it's important that you put certain safeguards. Have you notified your family and your colleagues where you would be? Does somebody else know what the situation is ongoing? Have you made, most institutions now have lawyers. Does your lawyer know that you are going to be releasing this story, and potentially you could be picked up, you could be detained, or you could even be sued? What can be done to ensure that action can be almost immediate when it happens? It's important that journalists begin to now do this prior planning and are better able to look at the situation holistically in order to, first of all, protect themselves. Second, to ensure that the story they want to bring out presents the facts as it is. And finally, that they are not putting themselves on any undue risk by not taking precautions and alerting people that would be in a position to act if any sort of action is meted out against them.
Press freedom is not just a fundamental human right, but one of the most important components of a democratic society. Therefore, Nigeria has to provide better protection for media to protect rights to free speech as well as freedom of expression.